Welcome everyone to today's BoF Professional Digital Live event. I'm Lauren Sherman, BoF's Executive Editor, and I am joined today by a superstar panel, including Tim Blanks, Editor-at-Large at the Business of Fashion, Robin Givhan, Fashion Critic of the Washington Post, and Rachel Tashjian, Staff Writer at GQ Magazine. And today we're going to be talking about the future of fashion shows, what fashion shows will look like, who will be attending them, what's happening, what are we doing? So we'll discuss the topic, then we're going to invite members of the community on stage to ask questions live. I have a feeling you all have a lot of questions today, so get ready. If you do want to ask a question, I'm just going to explain how the Zoom webinar platform works in case you don't know for some reason. If you'd like to write us a question, click the Q&A button in your bottom toolbar to send these straight through to us. Please click the Q&A button, not the chat function. And if you want to ask a question live, you'll have to turn on your webcam and audio so that we can see you and hear you. If you do need some further help, our customer support team is available via email on events@businessoffashion.com, and feel free to use the chat to talk. And if I am not too distracted, I will check in there to see if there's a conversation in there that I can pull into the conversation we're all having. So just to get started, first of all, thank you all for being here. I'm super grateful. I know you're all busy and probably planning your coverage for September. I think the first question is, what are you all planning? You all attend the shows, you write about the shows, you know, are masters of fashion. What are you gonna do this fall? Robin, are you gonna go to the shows in Europe, or are you gonna even go to the shows in New York?
Well, I've been saying that everything's a little bit fluid. The plan right now is that, yeah, I'll go up to New York. And, you know, I don't really know how much there will be to physically see. That's still sort of to be determined. But I think that it's important to go to New York if possible, and to give people a sense of not only what is happening with Fashion Week, but also what's not happening, like what's gone missing. So that's going to be sort of the challenge. And, you know, with the couture shows, which I normally don't cover, I did write about because they were online, they were all digital. So I think it's, you know, I'll sort of write about the way that fashion is unfolding at this time. But it'll be a very different kind of writing experience. It'll be a very different kind of season. And, you know, I'll change my format accordingly. I mean, I don't think it makes sense to, you know, review, quote unquote, a show, because I don't think it's really, so far, I haven't really seen a situation in which the clothes and the technology and the messaging comes through in a really forceful, eloquent way. If that should happen, then yeah, I would write about that, but I'm not sort of planning it that way.
Yeah. I want to talk about the audience's general appetite and interest in runway shows and how that has changed over the years. But first, Tim, you know, what are your plans so far? And you know, adding on to what Robin was talking about, how was the experience of covering couture for you?
I felt that sequence of shows and this sequence of shows are kind of like placeholders, because I still don't feel anyone really knows where we are. And probably this is a conversation that might be more nuanced in January or probably March. I felt covering the men, because I watched all the men's shows and the couture shows, and in the end, the things that were most most stimulating were the people who just went outside the box. You know, Jonathan Anderson with his boxes. He went inside the box and I think created the two experiences that were the most surprising and illuminating responses to the sort of exigencies of the moment. But then there were a lot of other things that I did like. I thought that I'm such a show hound. I mean, I would be the voice probably of the distant past in this debate for everything that fashion shows mean in fashion, and they mean almost everything in fashion to an enormous degree. So I don't know, I lost myself there. My train of reason periodically derails.
Oh, can I just piggyback onto what Tim was saying about Jonathan Anderson? I agree. I was completely charmed and infatuated with his show in a box. And when I thought about the reason why I found it so compelling, I realized that, you know, one thing that he did was, you know, I felt like there was such a reliance on technology, and there was this overwhelming sort of sense of how can we make the most of technology, so that in a lot of circumstances, I felt like what I was watching was a display of technology, as opposed to a display that connected you to the clothes. And there was something, and so Jonathan's show in a box was like very low tech. I mean, it was basically, you know, a FedEx delivery. But what it really tapped into was the desire for something tactile, the desire for something that felt personal, the desire for something that felt that it was meant for you, that you could hold, that wasn't, you know, a digital Zoom, aloof, distant thing. And it also just sort of reminded, I think it sort of took you back to the reason that so many people, whether designer, retailer, came into this business was because it was really fundamentally about the clothes, and everything else sort of got out of the way. And I'm not saying that everyone should sort of copy that idea, but I do think that the underlying philosophy that kind of led to that interpretation of it is definitely something that I think is very useful for people to consider.
It was funny because it was actually, for all its naivety, it was actually a celebration, the most sophisticated celebration of craft, which is what fashion is. So I thought that his boxes for both himself and Loewe were a true celebration of why we love fashion, because it had everything that you've ever loved about your favorite fashion show. You know, wit and color and imagination. And it was really, I've been thinking about, you know, Marcel Duchamp did his entire career in the box. Remember, he did that box with all his masterpieces this big. That kind of works for so many things. You're not diminishing fashion. You're actually expanding its ability to connect with everyone, because everyone could get that box. You know, every household in the world could get that Loewe box. And there's fashion. There's everything you loved about fashion. But I thought what was interesting is the things that I responded to most from that last little stretch were the naive things, which use technology in an incredibly naive way. Miharu Yasu, all the Japanese designers actually. Miharu Yasuhiro with his sock puppets. It was so poignant. I mean, way more poignant than sitting through his fashion show. And in the end, I thought I was going to hate, I thought I was just going to feel a little bit detached from it all, but I was surprised how often I was engaged by things I was looking at. And when I see this, what's coming up for the next little stretch of shows, how there are people who are planning purely digital presentations. There are people who are planning a mix of physical and digital. There are people who are doing purely physical presentations, streamed, I guess. I just imagine it will be the same kind of thing as before. I think it's nice when technology is turned to sort of naive purposes. It kind of works for me.
Although I thought the other show that was really fantastic was Galliano's Margella show, which was, as Robin was saying, a display of technology. And I thought did a nice job of sort of showing the way in which couture itself is a kind of display of technology. That felt like a bit of like a Nick Knight magnum opus. So it's interesting. I think, I really found that there was this added level to my job, which was assessing the sort of creative integrity of, these designers running at the idea of doing a digital show. And they responded to that, in some ways that were more naive, in some ways that were very florid and chaotic, and then many things in between.
But that was a good example of a show which used technology to celebrate the hand, because all the time you saw hands doing things. It was
even texting.
Yeah. All the time it was about the hand. And I think that's why, that's where the things that work best, and reminding you of what fashion is essentially a creation of, the human hand, coupled with, of course, the brain. But
what did you all think of the Hermes digital show?
I love that. I thought it was
a great example of
the scene. Yeah.
Because the thing that we haven't talked about is the commercial element of it. And I thought it was a nice commercial presentation. Whereas it's interesting because all of the things you're talking about, to me, the work that Jonathan Anderson did seemed to take an incredible amount of work, probably more than when you don't have the structure of a runway show. What do you do? And to me, it really kind of divided the creators that were able to cross over that bridge and do something more and different, because every season all of these designers are trying to do something different, but it is, when it comes down to it, that same structure. And it did feel like this really separated the wheat from the chaff in some ways, in terms of how they reacted to this whole situation, and also to creating something that was not in the traditional structure that they were used to.
I mean, I think sometimes boundaries can be good in a way. I mean, there were moments when, certain brands, I was just like, I don't need a 5-part digital experience in order to understand, what you're doing for a season. I don't need a 12-hour live stream of like you're shooting an advertising campaign, because basically out of 12 hours, 11 hours and 30 minutes are basically people standing around and waiting. And I also sort of felt like, just as a writer trying to cover it, I felt like I wanted the industry to have a beginning and an end to the shows. I didn't want to have to put an artificial end to the shows, sort of close the door down. But there was a certain point at which, we had decided, okay, we're going to do one sort of big feature about this season. And I had to make a decision that the story is going to run on this day, and therefore the last thing I'm going to look at is on this day. But then things just kept coming over the transom, like days and weeks after that. And, unless it's the most groundbreaking thing ever, at a certain point, I'm just like, I can't write about you anymore. Like it's not an individual story. It's not that intriguing. You've just come in too late. I'm sorry, my deadline's done. I'm finished.
Well, that kind of brings me to the question I brought up before, which is, what is your responsibility to the reader? how much do they want to know about this stuff? And what do you feel like, Robin and Tim, I'm curious, but Rachel also, being at GQ and in some ways people are coming to, they'll read anything any of you write, but what is the value of covering these shows? Are readers interested in them? And if so, how has that interest changed? Like, obviously they can go see the clothes look like this. So what are you bringing to the conversation that is making them want to tune in? And, how is that reflected this season in particular?
So at GQ, we have like a pretty specific understanding of who is reading our runway coverage because of, we're a website in addition to being a magazine. And so, we really do have an understanding that there's a demographic of mostly young men and some young women who are in their mid 20s to mid 30s, late 30s, who are following fashion and following the industry in the way that other people might follow sports. And we really do talk about covering fashion in the way that, you might cover sports. There are people who follow Hedi Slimane from house to house the way that other people follow LeBron from team to team. And so that's kind of how we're thinking about our coverage. And the way that bears out is that, our readers want to know, is this a great season of Prada? And if it's a great season of Prada, what is the grail, if you will? What is the sort of representative piece from this Craig Green collection? What is going to be either something that I can invest in or that I'll really want to, be wearing and could maybe, sell on Grailed or the Real or Depop. And again, there's also, within these sort of these readers who are really following these designers and industry goings on in this way, a lot of them are looking at these secondhand stores and thinking about, okay, who's having a renaissance right now? Who's having a really strong season? If a lot of people are showing this kind of suit, who is it originally referencing and how can I get that suit secondhand? So that's really, like, we're thinking a lot about, our reader wants to be confident and educated in the purchasing choices that he is making. And our runway coverage is really tailored to fit into that goal.
So that's very service oriented then, would you say?
In a certain way. Yeah, I would say in a certain way. But, we do have like a service element to the site, which is our recommends page. But primarily, I mean, we're writing, I would emphasize that it is about the sort of culture of fashion, and the sort of like noise around the clothes, but of course also the clothes themselves.
Robin, how has your coverage of shows changed over the years and the purpose of covering shows, especially, obviously everyone in the industry reads you, but you have a very consumer audience. I'd say maybe more than any other major critic.
When you say consumer, you mean just sort of a general audience, yeah?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when I cover the collections, I mean, one of the things that we've learned is that there's definitely, sort of the fashion fan who is very much interested in each and every show, but that's far and away not our primary audience. They're not coming to the Washington Post so that they can see, every look from a particular show in a gallery. Our reader is more interested in what did a particular designer's work have to say about the way that our culture is shifting, about the way women's roles are changing, about the power dynamic. There's also an element of, the sheer sort of entertainment and beauty of fashion. If there is a collection that is just sort of exquisite in what a designer has been able to accomplish, our readers are interested in that as a sort of representation of fashion as, a kind of artful endeavor. And then there's the industry part of it as well, the shifting nature of the business and the way that it relates to our consumption habits, the way that it relates to the global economy and who's sort of got the clout, and who's just sort of along for the ride. And so I think now that the shows most recently were so digital, our reader was not coming to sort of know what did, Dior look like for the season. Our reader was more interested in the fact that the Dior presentation seemed to have this incredibly thin ear for what has been an enormous shift in terms of representation. And why did Dior look the way that it did, which was almost exclusively white models? And what does that say about Dior's understanding of this moment? What does it say about the way that fashion is grappling with the social upheaval? So, in writing about the Dior show, I'm obviously, going to talk about the clothes to some degree, but my interest is much more focused on sort of what does Dior mean as this cultural institution?
Mm. Tim, how has your coverage of fashion shows changed over the years?
It feels like it's got a lot windier. It feels like when I started, everything was a lot more concise, and I kind of drifted. I think that I write because I've never thought of myself as a fashion person. I'm not from a fashion background. I kind of drifted into this by a complete accident, like climbing off an iceberg or something. I write about fashion like as if I was writing about movies or music or theater or ballet or opera. One thing that struck me when I started writing about fashion is how it was low man on the totem pole. And I was always laughing when some behemoth who wrote about football or something would give me a hard time because I was writing about fashion like I was a lesser species. And I think it was always because fashion never had a canon of any kind. There was never the exalted Clement Greenberg or whoever from the past who established this. So it always seemed to me like fashion needed stories told about it. And so I just tell stories, really.
Yeah. I also think it has a lot to do with the fact that most of the people running those general publications in particular have been men and old typically and don't show an interest. I think that that's still an issue at a lot of big important publications where you hear the editor hates fashion.
Yeah.
You never hear the editor hating TV.
Yeah, or the head of
or
the
something like
hates
that.
fashion or whatever. Yeah, that's always that. Yeah.
What about for the BoF audience? You've been here for 5 years. This is your 5-year or 6-year?
5.
5 years this September.
Amazing. Oh God.
I know. I remember the day.
Yeah. Peter Pan. I think that I have no idea. It's interesting because I don't know. Do you get feedback? Rachel, Robin, do you get a lot of feedback?
From readers or from my editors?
From your readers. Do you get feedback from your readers?
Yeah, well, yes. Every season, there is the mandatory email from the guy who wants to know why the models aren't smiling. There's the mandatory email from the guy who wants to know, oh my God, why do you cover this? No one wears those clothes. I've never ever seen anyone walking down the street looking like that. And often my response is, then you're clearly walking down the wrong streets. Mm-hmm. But then there's a completely other part of the readership that, is really interested and is fascinated by the culture of fashion
and responsive to you.
And really responsive and really interested in just sort of the social shifts that fashion represents. And that's really gratifying. I mean, there's nothing more gratifying than getting the email from a reader that begins with, I'm not interested in fashion, quote unquote, but I thought this story was so fascinating. Yeah. And I always try to say to that person, we're all interested in fashion. maybe there's a particular kind of fashion story that you're not interested in, but we are all deeply invested in how we appear to the world. And that is ultimately what fashion is. So that when I get stuff like that, I mean, it's great. And I will say that also when I write about just sort of the fashion of public figures and such, the thing that's always interesting to me is that men are much more likely to respond to a story and, you know, sort of talk about what they were wearing. And then the other thing I wanted to say, Lauren, when you were talking about just sort of the, you know, from that voice from on high saying, oh, I hate fashion, like some editor, I've often thought that so much of the reason why fashion sort of would get short shrift is because it was for so long seen as, you know, the purview of women. And I always thought it was just like a very sexist thing. And sports were sort of seen as the world of men. And particularly like with politics, and, you know, politicians were always really happy to talk about their favorite sports team. And, you know, there were all those stories about how you could tell so much about Obama by the way he played basketball. And I'm like, seriously? And I would argue that you can also tell a lot about people by where they prefer to shop and the kind of clothes that they wear. So I think even, especially now, like writing about fashion has even more sort of social clout because so many more women who felt unheard are finding their voices. And this is an area in which that does in many ways still belong very much to women. And I think they should take ownership of that and celebrate it and sort of dig in and dig down for those really empowering stories. Okay, I'm off my soapbox.
I'm going to get on for 1 minute, and then Rachel, I want you to weigh in. But I always say you can hide your taste in music, you can hide your taste in television, you can hide your taste in cinema, but you cannot hide the way you dress. And I think it makes people deeply insecure and uncomfortable. And so they kind of say, I hate it. I don't want to be involved because they feel so vulnerable. And so I mean, all three of you have spent your careers thus far kind of pushing back on that, and it's really admirable. And I'm sure a lot of the people in the audience who are listening, you should read all of these writers if you don't already. But Rachel, I'm curious to know from you. You work at a place where being vulnerable and being male is like very encouraged, and it's this new way, what the issue you guys did on the new masculinity. How do you see your readers reacting to clothes? And I think the men's fashion, consumer fashion scene is so fascinating from that perspective.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something that we're talking about a lot. I mean, I think something that that I've certainly found to be the case is that, you know, everyone, and it's not just men, everyone feels like they have to be really careful right now in the way that they articulate themselves and expressing themselves and experimenting. And fashion is really a place where particularly men can be playful and they can make mistakes and they can experiment. And the consequences for wearing something that doesn't look quite right or that doesn't fit are okay. You know, it's sort of a safe space, to use an overused phrase. And I think it's interesting that the readers who we hear from a lot are often readers who are imitating things that they've seen styled in the magazine. We had a lot of readers, we had Robert Pattinson on the cover a couple of months ago, sort of quarantined in his apartment in London. And I had a number of GQ readers DM me pictures of themselves dressed like Robert Pattinson. And I wrote a story for the August issue about archival Armani and what was called Armani's sincere look in the early 90s that was responding to this, decade of capitalist excess. And a number of readers have sent me pictures of themselves wearing looks inspired by that, or have said, I've gone on the RealReal and I found this vintage Armani suit and it's just arrived. The other funny thing is that I do hear from a lot of people who are much younger than me, and I'm in my early 30s, who tell me I've got things wrong. because there's this huge audience of these really passionate fashion fanatics, a lot of them on what's called high fashion Twitter, who are in their teens and their early 20s, and who are aspiring designers or aspiring critics, and are really engaged in this debate online about what designer is sort of underrated or misunderstood, or what is the Chanel archive that Virginie Viard is tapping into. And so I hear a lot from those readers as well, who tell me, oh, this is not what Hedi Slimane was doing at all. But so that's kind of who I'm hearing from.
It's exciting. It's great to hear that there are people.
So I love hearing that, because I don't get a response. Sometimes I feel like I'm just in a vacuum. I don't ever hear from a soul about anything I do. But
Tim, I email you all the time.
You do. Yeah, that's why I love you. But kids do stop me in the street. Kids, I mean, like, we're talking teenagers, or nobody from my own age group ever says anything about what I do. I don't think they even know what I do. But and they actually would say, they would be the people who said you went to Claude Montana shows. They would be the ones who were like, oh my God, what was a Terry Mugler show like? I mean, and of course, I'm so happy to be, granddad fashion and sit them around the digital campfire and tell them how incredible these, and this comes back to the premise about the whole fashion show thing. It truly is what you're saying, Rachel, that the younger the audience, the more interested they are in everything in the past. I guess, is it Gen Z? Is it that just are really absorbed in how everything got to where it is? And I found that right through, because I used to do this TV show that was on all over the world, and I still have kids like, oh, we're from Mexico City, and we just, we watched you every Saturday morning, and it's always them. And it's so interesting, because you really get a sense then of what fashion's hold on people can be, and what it means to them, and what they're seeing when they look at a fashion show on YouTube or wherever they're seeing them. But I find that quite, that's one thing I do find inspiring about doing what I do.
Well, I do think that it's funny, because that younger generation, like 2 removed from me, just seems so much more able to fashion their own identity in the way that they choose. And I think fashion is one of the tools that they use so much more freely and so much more enthusiastically than Gen X did, or baby boomers did, or like whatever, like other generations, to some degree even more so than millennials, because there's just a tremendous freedom that isn't tethered to perceptions about gender, about sexuality, about power. All those things free them, I think, to use fashion in really dynamic ways.
And information too. I used to watch you, Tim, on E! In the US on weekends at my grandparents, because they had cable and we didn't. And that was my exposure. But like, there was the internet when I was in middle school, but not really. There were no fashion blogs. There was not as much information. And now they have all that information. I used to buy British Vogue and French Vogue and things like that, but now they have all this information. They can read all of you all the time. And I think that has opened up that world as well.
If you go back and you look at shows if you look at a Lacroix show from the late 80s, or a Galliano show from the mid 90s, or a McQueen show, McQueen is really a lodestone in all of this for kids, I think. If you look at them, and you completely divorce yourself from the fact that you were there or whatever. I don't know if you find this, Robin or Rachel, but probably not Rachel, because you would have been in diapers at the time I'm talking about. But when you look at those shows with virgin eyes, they are so they are they're a vision of an entirely alien time. And it's like watching a film with Nijinsky dancing or something. They're so magnificent, but also so engaged in, they challenge, they provoke, they're disturbing, they're overwhelming. And I really see that kids looking at them, they see a world that's gone in a way. It's like if somebody dug up a Super 8 camera from the Titanic and you saw this wonderful, whatever it was, lost world. It has that kind of poignant kind of tug, I think. It does for me, and I was there, but I'm able to divorce myself from reason when I look at those things. So I just wonder if that's coming back to the original notion about the fashion show, that I don't know how you would ever, it's the fashion show was the power of fashion. Maybe is.
I feel like the fashion shows, particularly, you mentioned McQueen, the ones that you remember are the ones that really touched an emotional core. And the McQueen shows were deeply emotional. And and there are others, maybe a dozen or so others that over the course of many years, I still sort of remember what it felt like to be there. But I still think that, I don't know, was it the last Balenciaga show that I saw? It feels like it was 500 years ago, in the submerged, where it felt like you were submerged in the space that was submerged, and they were sort of walking on water, and it smelled sort of vaguely like, I don't know, propane flowing into a lake, and it was very dystopian. And I found that so disturbing and incredibly invigorating at the same time, which is probably a very twisted reaction. But it was, for me, it was definitely one of those moments at a fashion show where I just felt like this really sort of rises above a conversation that's just about the clothes and into something else that is going to stay with me for a while.
Totally. But going back, I mean, you could go all the way back to just the stillness of fashion shows, that the way fashion shows used to be an hour long and completely kind of like a dream. Like they moved at this somnolent pace, and I just remember, I guess some of them I was bored, absolutely rigid, and wanted to chew my own arm off. But there were others that would just, I mean, I always think about Claude Montana shows, even though they were 2 hours late, and even though everything about them felt like an abuse of human rights on so many levels, that they're just the absolute quietness, the sort of elegance, felt like a strange lesson that you were being given all the time. And I feel that's why, that was the significance of shows then. And it's still, you talk about that Balenciaga show, The Drowned World. I mean, where they just hit this chord, and it honestly is like, it's transcendent.
It's so funny that you mentioned Claude Montana, because I think I've gone to one Claude Montana show in my entire life. I had just started covering the fashion industry. I was working for a newspaper in Detroit. And to this day, I still have PTSD from the horrors of that show. It was truly one of those shows that in my memoir, it will be an entire chapter of just like public shaming for the sheer pleasure of torturing someone.
Mm-hmm. There was
the question I have for both of you is, do you remember the clothes from those Claude Montana shows? God, because the Balenciaga show, will you remember the clothes from that show?
Less so.
I only remember my physical and mental anguish from the Claude Montana show. So no, I don't remember the clothes. I do remember the clothes from the Balenciaga show.
I hope
do you think
so.
it will stick in your mind? Do you think that the Balenciaga show will be one of those 10 years from now still in your top 10 of most memorable, including the clothes?
Yes, although I would also say that in all likelihood, I probably will not remember the clothes as clearly 10 years from now, but I do think I will remember the way that I felt in the middle of that show. And that feeling will absolutely inform me about what Balenciaga was in 2020.
Yeah. So I want to open up to the audience, but one more question on this idea of, the value of a fashion show. And you're all reporters, and I'm sure attending shows is important to you to be able to make your reporting complete. But compared to 15 years ago or 20 years ago, when the shows weren't so readily available, the conversation wasn't so readily available, how has the value of a fashion show changed for people like you? Is it the fact that you need to the conversations that you have with your seatmate? Is it just the being there? What do you feel the need to be at every single thing compared to the need to be at every single thing, pre style.com or pre 2010 maybe? Feel like, to me, that's when things started to really change in 2008 or 2009.
I mean, I don't, just as a reporting tool, I don't think that there's anything better than being at a fashion show and walking into that room and pretty much knowing that anyone in the industry that you need to talk to, you will be able to hunt them down in person at some point during the day. And they won't be able to flee.
Yeah.
That's just the best thing. And I am never more delighted than when the seating means that I end up next to, the president of like Bergdorf or something, because then I feel like I've just got this captive audience for a 30-minute wait in which I get to have a conversation about, the industry with someone that can be challenging to, pin down for that amount of time just to sort of chit chat. So that is an immeasurable value of the shows, being able to have conversations with stylists and with other editors and with other designers who sometimes are at, their friends' shows. I think that's immeasurable.
Yeah, I think for those reasons, it really does make the live show the essential, or like the easiest way to sort of like push through the marketing apparatus of fashion, because there is this really significant canon of independent and emerging designers who aren't necessarily like plugged into, a certain kind of marketing push around what it is that is interesting about what they're doing right now. For example, like we've been sort of tracking what we're calling the Yoji Sans at GQ, because a lot of the younger designers we follow are really attuned to what Yoji is doing now, and what he's been doing, his looking through his archives. And that's something that, Yoji Yamamoto is not going to like push a big marketing campaign in the way that a company under the LVMH umbrella, might do something like that. And so it's just essential to sort of be at those shows and talk to people in the room and see how like, the energy is responding to a particular designer over, a period of seasons.
Tim, what is the value of a fashion show for you now versus back then?
Like Robin was saying, that there's a cast of characters that you have totally easy access to. It used to be easier because I used to be backstage talking to hair and makeup and models and the whole panoply of people. That did kind of, I think the intrusion of PR changed that whole that whole aspect of the industry quite a lot. Once everything was everything is incredibly controlled. And I feel what once that had kicked in, and once it wasn't just, oh, let's go backstage and talk to the designer, you know, it was also easy. And oh, there's so-and-so, and there's Bernardo Bertolucci, and there's Twiggy or whatever, you know, it was just all this kind of the rich tapestry. I feel that the rich tapestry got a little less rich. So I think in a funny way, everything became more focused on the actual catwalk, what was happening on the catwalk, which I suppose is a good thing in a way for the designers, provided they're putting something on the catwalk that merits your full attention. Because there were some extremely mediocre designers who always had fabulous window dressing, you know, their favorite actresses or their favorite, you know, or a mum and dad or something. That was always good copy. And that kind of shifted a little bit. But I think for me, it does all come down to what's on the catwalk. And I've seen like 15 million fashion shows in my time, and I will still look forward to seeing them. I never ever thought, oh God, what am I doing with my life or anything? But I feel ultimately when I read Robin, or when I read Rachel, or when I read anyone who's writing about fashion, I'm reading their stories. And the better the storyteller, the more I stay intrigued, entranced. And, you know, that's the most you can hope, the best you can hope for, is that a designer wants to tell you a really good story, I think. And there are a lot more stories to tell now, so.
Lots more.
Makes sense.
So I think certainly it makes a lot of sense. I love reading your stories too. So we're gonna open this up to the audience. The first person is Dan from London. And if you haven't noticed, Tim has been doing reviews of past shows. It's his top fashion shows of all time every Friday on the site. And they're really amazing.
I would love to say they're not the top shows. They're my favorite.
Okay.
They're shows that resonated with
Tim's fashion shows.
Yeah,
of all
for some
time.
reason, you know, they're not necessarily the greatest fashion shows, but they're ones that Robin was saying that have stayed, you know, that have stayed with me for 35 years or so. So yes.
Yeah, I love the Romeo Gigli one in particular. I thought that was really, really good. I think Dan is here.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Dan.
Hi.
Hello.
Hey everyone. Sorry. Yeah. So basically, my question. You guys talked a little bit about that earlier. The fashion show is also about socialization, and all the events basically that orbit around the fashion show is all the showroom appointments and the dinner parties and the afterworks. So I was wondering, in your opinion, how all of these things are going to change, given that we can't even sit next to each other now if we do attend a fashion show. So do you think the industry can afford to lose all of that socialization orbiting around the fashion shows?
Sounds like
Anyone
a
want to jump in?
I mean, I hope not. I think that, yeah, in the short term, that's going to be something that is, if not lost, is greatly decreased. And I think that's really unfortunate, and it certainly makes my job more challenging. I have found that, you know, people are more interested in, more willing to, you know, do video phone calls and things like that. So you still have a little bit more of a connection than if you were just sort of doing a audio call. But yeah, I think that's very sadly one of the things that is going missing. And I think it's going to be more challenging for fashion to create that sense of community. I don't know if the shows are going to have to be, the shows that there are going to have to be that much more profound in some way, or if there some other kind of event will rise up to create that kind of interaction. I'm an optimist, so I sort of think that typically something does rise up to fill the vacuum.
Tim or Rachel, do you have anything to add?
Yeah.
I mean, I would just add that I found it really unnerving to be covering the shows in July and not, when you're leaving the show, everyone is sort of talking about, oh, what did you think of this? What did you think of that? And it's not merely the sort of publicist organized or brand sponsored events that you end up having these important conversations at, but just sort of like the casual run-ins between shows and having dinner with someone, with another writer, with an editor, a designer. And I just felt like I was like a lone woman, like operating in the wild in a certain way, like with, like texting my friends constantly, like, what did you think of that? What did you think of that? And like,
you can call me Rachel.
Okay, I'll do it. Just because, that's such a, I mean, I like in January was in the car with our deputy fashion director, Nikki, after all the shows. And like, we would discuss like ad nauseum, like everything that we were seeing. And so I just think that is such an essential part of what you do that you really can't replicate if you don't have these live events of some kind.
Well, Nicole,
sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, Nicole Phelps and I always used to laugh that we spent so much time in our rooms writing reviews and things that we never got to do any of the socialization. So our time in fashion would end without us actually ever going to a glamorous dinner party like everybody else always seemed to be doing. It was always, dinner parties and nightclubs and stuff, and we were kind of chained to our laptops, churning copy up. But I never regretted that much. I mean, maybe I missed a few things.
You know what I really miss a lot is, and this happens particularly in Paris, and that is that sense of how international the industry is. And you don't really get that so much in New York, but when you're in Paris and just, even if it's, a 1-minute conversation with an editor from Italy, or a conversation as you're waiting to go into a show, or sharing a car with a British editor, or even just another American editor, but one who lives across the country. I just feel like part of what makes fashion such a unique industry is its international, the internationalness of it. And at a live show, you really get that sense, and you really get the sense of how all of these different cultures connect. And, sitting with my dog, in my home office, watching shows online, like you don't get that.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Dan. We appreciate it. Next up is Elaine from Washington, D.C. Yeah, I think, Tim, I'm always in the hotel room, and I think just being there and hearing what other people are talking about at parties is the way I do a lot of my reporting.
But it used to drive me insane during the men's shows because there seemed to be so much going on that I was never ever part of. But you know what? It's funny, Robin, you say you're sitting with your dog, so it's two barks yes, 1 bark no, Dogs, no.
Hi, Elaine.
Hi guys, how are you?
Hi, Elaine.
Hi, Robin.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Sorry, I know her.
Perfect.
my question today around runway shows. So I work right now with African brands in fashion and luxury, and a lot of them are in a space and place where they're hopping off the traditional calendar. So there is a bit of uncertainty around what editors want to cover. You know, are they, of course, we're hitting spring, summer 2021, but a lot of them are staying with fall and saying, this is what I'm going to do now, and the see now, buy now model. And so my question to you is, how do you as editors, what kind of format do you find most appealing? You know, do you still want the traditional runway format from a designer? Do you want a one-on-one? Do you want a digital? Do you want a lookbook? And if the season is off calendar, how does that factor into how brands should approach you and invite you or ask you for your coverage?
Well, one thing that is really interesting about covering fashion at GQ is that a lot of menswear designers do not do menswear shows or runway shows, I should say, and have never done them. So like Evan Kenori has never done a runway show. And Fear of God, you know, presented Jerry Lorenzo presented his collection in mid-August, kind of like off season, and in fact had taken a couple of seasons off. You know, Supreme doesn't do runway shows. So I find that like actually, you know, there is a lot of this, like, should we show, should we not show? And there are all of these, I think, brands that are communicating really effectively without that sort of traditional runway show. Like, you know, Ame Leon Dore is another brand that we've been talking a lot about over the past year. And they did this incredible kind of, it was almost like a traditional ad campaign. I felt like I was watching like a prime era Gap ad of all these different sort of like friends and family of the brand. And they released the campaign on Instagram, and people were talking about that in the menswear community, you know, all of last week. So I think there are a lot of different ways to build buzz and excitement, you know, outside of that sort of that runway model. I mean, people pay really close attention to like Supreme's lookbooks and Palace's lookbooks and Noah's lookbooks. I mean, those are sort of, people really pour through those in the way that some people pour through runway images.
Yeah, I would just jump in as someone, I'm fielding a lot of stuff for other writers as well. And what I think a lot of young brands, they really want, and also to be honest, every brand, they really want the review. They want the Tim review, and that's all they want. And you know, the thing is, if Tim was writing 500 reviews, then who is that good for? No one. You know, it's better for, I think, for writers if they want to review a show because they feel compelled to do so and they have something to say. But Fear of God, Jerry Lorenzo is a good example. He had his first collection in 2 years, which was inspired by Armani, Rachel. So that kind of came out like the same time. And Tim did a podcast with him where they talked for an hour. I reported on the collection, not from just, I went and met with him in his studio in LA, and I was working on a bigger feature and incorporated his approach into that. And I don't know how they feel, but from our perspective, like, that covering Fear of God in that way and not having Tim just do a straight runway review was probably much more valuable for them. And so I think that's one thing that I would encourage brands to, and young designers to understand, that developing a relationship with Tim, whether or not that means that he's going to do this huge opus, is way more important than him dedicating one post to you.
I would say what I feel now, what I respond to is the talking to the person. You know, if you actually are in touch with the individual, that it almost in a funny way, they can tell you about what they're doing, and you can write about that, or we can do a podcast on that, or a Zoom or whatever. The voice of the designer is what I respond to. And I think, Elaine, you know, when you're talking about what the best thing for me is, because it's always been that way, like Rachel is saying, especially in menswear, some of the greatest menswear designers never had a show. but you would go and talk to them. You'd look at the clothes with them. It would be, in a way, more meaningful than if you'd sat there and watched some styled moment that you didn't feel was necessarily intrinsically them. I feel that now, especially, the story that they want to tell is what I want to hear, and I want it from them. So there's the ways that we've found to talk to each other over this lockdown year. I hope they'll stay in a way. You know, I hope that there will be this immediate contact, that this sort of intimacy. I find that more interesting maybe than the ways that we used to deal with things. You know, I don't want a press release. I want to talk to people.
You'll get an email from me then.
I just put myself on a big spot.
Elaine, thank you so much for your
Thank you, Elaine.
question.
Thank you.
Great. Do you all have time for one more really quick one? If you have to go, it's okay.
I don't have to go anywhere.
Great, thank you so much.
Been everywhere already.
Next is Louisa from Germany, and then we will wrap up.
Hi.
Hi, Louisa.
Hello.
Hi. So glad to be here. I'm a bit nervous now being live. But yeah, my question kind of follows up on the beginning from your discussion where you've mentioned the recent events happening. And I think if you're looking at the recent developments of fashion shows, like the concept of the fashion show even comes more into focus than maybe the actual clothes themselves. So the whole concept or the whole event conception transformed into like a huge marketing concept, I think. So if you're looking at the current digital formats, do you think that the emotional atmosphere of a physical event can actually be transformed in digitally? And if so, how do you evaluate immersive techniques like VR, AR? Do you think that would be possible for a broad crowd? Or I think like the point of like transforming or translating the emotion that a physical event develops from the viewers, if that's actually possible to kind of show to a broad experience digitally.
Well, I've had some incredible VR experiences. I think that movie that Inarritu made about the crossing the border, the immigrants crossing the migrants crossing the border between Mexico and the States was just so visceral. And I think about that all the time. If you could apply that intensity to a fashion presentation, the only thing is how do you scale it? That the challenge is how do you scale it for an audience? I think the emotional impact of a physical fashion show is possible to duplicate that using technology. I'm not quite sure how yet. I mean, movies make me cry, so I don't see why a digital version of a fashion show wouldn't either. But I haven't yet wrapped my head around how that's possible. I don't know what you think, Robin or Rachel, but
yeah, I mean, I have to say that, you know, I've seen sort of the live stream of the fashion show, the digital version of the fashion show. And typically I don't find that to be particularly interesting. And in part I think it's because I am being forced to look in one particular direction. Yeah. I'm being forced to see one particular thing. And part of the experience of being at a fashion show is that your eyes can wander around the room, and at least for me, sometimes I find the most interesting element to be something that's over in a corner. That's not sort of the main thing that's walking down the runway towards me. And with film, you know, the objective is to use the technology to tell a story. And I think when designers use whatever technology they're using to tell a story about their clothing, to weave a narrative in some way, and it certainly doesn't have to be, you know, a linear narrative, but just to kind of to tell a story, to evoke emotion. I think it's possible to duplicate that in real life experience. But when it's really the idea of taking the traditional runway show and trying to interpret that in a digital way, it feels a little bit like trying to put a square peg in a round hole, you know, like something that just doesn't really quite fit. And I'm trying to think of situations or an occasion where I've sort of seen, I can remember that working, and one doesn't really come to mind. I'm sure there have been instances when it has worked to profound effect, but I can't think of one off the top of my head.
Yeah,
and
I think,
and I just want to say, not that they've been awful, it's just like they haven't been really evocative.
Have you ever
Yeah.
cried at a fashion show?
However, what?
Have you ever cried at a fashion show?
No. But, you know, I have a heart of stone.
I think that has to do more with what you're dealing with. I've cried at fashion shows that were not that good because I just had other stuff going on.
yeah.
You're like, oh my God, or everything was so bad, and
Rachel,
you go
have
to
you cried
one
at a
that's
fashion show?
okay.
Ever?
No, I haven't.
Deeply
No.
moved. I remember I went to one of the first shows I ever went to was a Jeffrey Bean show at the not the Plaza, the what's the hotel opposite the Plaza on Fifth Avenue?
Sherry Netherland?
Sherry
Sherry
Netherland?
Netherland?
Jeffrey Bean at Sherry Netherland? Is that possible? And Diana Vreeland and all these women were in the front row crying. And I was quite taken aback that they were crying at a fashion show. And I thought, is this a sort of gold standard? And then years later, I found myself kind of deeply moved every now and again. I was really taken aback. Like, I cry at TV commercials, and I found myself crying at the odd fashion show because of it was just an emotional weight, and the whole notion of duplicating that digitally is I don't think it's an impossible challenge. I do think it's possible. Louisa.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're talking about is like technology being in the service of human connection, you know, and that's sort of what has gotten us through the past several months. And I think that the digital shows that did have a sense of intimacy or, you know, a way of connecting with the viewer were the ones that were really successful. I mean, I think that's part of what made the Hermes show so special. And in some ways, strangely, that I found that Hermes show to be like a truer to Hermes than doing the typical like sort of big box show that they normally do, because it was this very intimate, carefully choreographed, elegant, quiet, perfectly executed presentation, which to me is, you know, when I think about Hermes, that's what it is. So I think, you know, if technological developments can be in the service of connecting the designer's vision to the audience, then that is what I think makes for a really successful digital show.
And you know, we were just saying about getting hearing the voice of the designer, that felt to me so much like a sort of crystallization of the personality of the Hermes designer. Because she's so quiet and kind of closed, and then to see her just zapping around and doing all that stuff, I thought, yeah, that was truly illuminating. I loved that.
Louisa, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm gonna get in huge trouble because we're really going over really quickly. Prabal Garung. He is not camera ready, but he wanted to ask us, and I do think this is important, in this particular time where we're talking about diversity, a seat at the table, inclusivity, what has struck me the most has been the lack of diversity among the writers and reviewers. It's something I've noticed in my decade-long career. How do you go about making that change? And more than that, do you think it's important to have a different point of view that's perhaps slightly freer from a singular lens? I'd say how to go about it is to, hire people with different points of views and different backgrounds, and also encourage that kind of critical thinking in younger people, which it sounds like it's happening. And I for one, am confident that the next generation of critics and reporters will be more diverse and complex. But I'm curious to know what you all think. And then we really do have to go, or the BoF Live team is going to be very mad at me.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously hugely important in fashion. It's important in other areas of cultural criticism, whether it's film or music, dance. I mean, I think all of those areas would do well to have a more diverse group of critics, in part because the material that is being presented to a broad audience, and I think every critic brings a point of view, and and it's important to have a lot of different eyes looking at a particular subject. I think it perhaps would be easier to do that if the industry sort of broaden its concept of where to look for writers to cover the industry, if it sort of broaden its concept of what it means to write critically about fashion. I think there has been for a long time a sort of, fairly narrow definition of what is required to be able to cover the fashion industry. I think broadening that could certainly open the door wider. And then some of it is just purely, a matter of intent to make sure that when, publications or entities are looking for new voices, that they talk to as many different people as they can. And if they look out and see that the talent pool that they're drawing from all looks the same, says this isn't good enough, and we have to look harder.
Robin, thank you so much. Prabal, thank you for your question. It's really important. Robin, Rachel, Tim, thank you all for doing this. It was so great. I love talking to each of you. I also want to remind the audience that Tim is going to be speaking with Kathy Horn tomorrow, right?
Yes.
So it's going to be a chit chat with Tim and Kathy, which I will definitely be tuning in. And I just want to thank the audience. You all kind of stuck around. I am always checking the participants tag, and I appreciate it. And again, thanks to everyone who joined today. It means a lot. And thanks to the BoF Live team. I am really sorry I went over. Definitely check out Tim and Kathy's panel tomorrow. Do you know what time it is?
It's
Tim,
3 o'clock,
by any chance?
3 o'clock UK, so 10 o'clock New York, and
10 a.m. Eastern.
10 a.m. Eastern, yeah.
Yes, so
definitely. It's, I'm just thinking, I don't know when we'll actually, I feel this sort of poignant thing now that I don't know when we'll actually see each other in the flesh. When I will see Robin or Rachel just sitting there at a fashion show. At a fashion show.
I know.
Strange.
True. It is quite strange. Well, thanks everyone again for joining, and have a really good day. And if you need anything, you can email me on lauren.sherman@businessaffashion.com. I welcome ideas, tips, etc.